Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Azim bin Akmar. So today I would like to start the presentation with a summary of the case study of my group. So, in December 2015, the Paris Agreement brought together 195 nations in a historic commitment to combat climate change. This agreement aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally. However, it relies on voluntary targets which raises significant concern about whether we can meet the critical goal of limiting global temperature rise to 2 Celsius. Its consequences are more severely felt by vulnerable populations, especially in developing countries. Current action or inaction carry profound implications for future generations. This case study highlights the ethical dilemma we face, which is a global commitment to act, the shared responsibility to preserve our planet, and the need for stronger international cooperation to move beyond the limitation of the Paris Agreements. Ultimately, it is our ethical duty to leave a habitable planet for future generations to live and coexist harmony without climate issue.
Let's start with the foundation of our discussion, ethics. The word ethics originates from the Greek word ethos, which signifies a group or culture's character, spirit, and attitude, as described by Khalid Ali and others in 2018. While often used interchangeably with moral philosophy, ethics extend beyond that. Ethics involve analyzing morality and determining what is right. It challenges us to understand how people or societies reach this conclusion. Importantly, ethics equips us with tools to evaluate and understand moral principles, enabling us to foresee and weigh the consequences of our action on ourselves and others. Whether in personal or professional setting, ethics serve as a critical pillar. In professional context, best practices in ethics offer a framework for accountability, fairness, and respect. These principles are often outlined in codes of ethics, which come in various forms, such as compliance-based code focusing on rule and regulation of integrity-based code centered on values and moral judgment. Ethics transcend legal requirements, fostering self-awareness, responsibility, and fairness. It encourages us to evaluate not just the immediate, but also the broader consequences of our decision. In today's world, ethics is not static. It evolves to meet modern social challenges. Professional best practices guided by codes of ethics create a foundation of credibility, impartiality, and fairness. These guidelines not only help individuals and organizations navigate ethical dilemmas but also contribute positively to society as a whole. Let's begin by addressing the question: what harm could arise if we fail to take action against climate change? Conversely, what harms might be produced by acting to lower carbon emission? First, the potential harms of failing to act on climate change are significant. It is because rising global temperature, climate change has already caused a noticeable increase in global average temperature. As reported by the European Commission, extreme heat events like heatwaves have become more frequent, damaging infrastructure, reducing productivity, and increasing mortality rates. By 2024, average global temperatures are expected to exceed 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial level, marking a critical threshold. Next, rising sea levels. Due to warming ocean and melting glaciers, sea levels continue to rise. Projection suggests that by the end of the century, Europe could experience a 60 to 80 cm sea level increase. For countries like Malaysia located near the equator, the risks are even greater due to south weather intrusion, which impact agriculture and freshwater supply. Number 3. Threat to infrastructure and businesses. Climate change damages infrastructure, particularly in regions prone to urban heat island and flash flood. Businesses are also affected as extreme weather events disrupt operation, increase costs, and reduce economic stability. Number 4. Impact on tourism. Tourism, a sector contributing 10% of global GDP and supporting 320 million jobs, faces significant risk from extreme weather events. Flood, drought, and heat wave interrupt travel plans, forcing the industry to adapt by reducing emissions and adopting sustainable practices. Now, let's consider the other side. The harms of acting the lower carbon emission. Economic challenges. Transitioning to low carbon energy can slow industrial growth, raise energy costs, and place an economic burden on developing nations reliant on affordable fossil fuel. Next, social impact. The economic sacrifice needed to reduce emissions can lead to higher costs of living, job losses in high emission industry, and social frustration, especially when governments struggle to balance economic pressure with climate commitments. The next one is global inequalities. Wealthier nations often have the resources to invest in green technologies, leaving poorer countries at a disadvantage. This disparity exacerbates inequalities both within and between nations. Number 4. Voluntary nature of climate commitments. Since the Paris Agreement relies on voluntary participation, there is a risk of reduced commitment during economic crisis, which could undermine public trust and long-term progress. Number 5. Intergenerational ethical dilemma. Lastly, as Professor Gardiner highlights, the current generation faces the challenge of balancing economic and social needs with the responsibility of protecting the environment for future generations. In summary, the decision to act or not act on climate change involves complex trade-offs. The goal is to strike a balance between immediate needs and long-term sustainability for the benefit for both society and the planet.
As for the second question, the current generation have a moral duty to act in a way that do not harm the others, especially the future generation. It is necessary to focus on safeguarding the welfare of the vulnerable group, including children and the future generations. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, children born today will experience unusual climate problems such as extreme weather events and food and water scarcity as a result of the action or lack thereof taken by the current generation. So it is important to balance the current interests with the rights and needs of the future generations. Minority groups that have made the least contribution to the greenhouse gas emission are the most severely impacted by these consequences on climate change. Justice and fairness are called into doubt by this injustice. Unchecked climate change could worsen already existing inequalities by causing a large migration and conflict over limited resources, as what we observed by the United Nations. Thereof, it is ethical duty of the current generation to take immediate action to stop such event. So the current generation are responsible for leaving a sustainable and habitable planet for the future generation. Proactive measures are justified to prevent a potential harm to the environment and public health, even with incomplete scientific certainty. By applying this principle, policymakers can justify immediate action against the climate change based on potential risks to the future population. As for the third question, the challenging task of combating the climate change requires establishing a balance between the short-term financial uses and the long-term environmental benefit. Investing in green technologies, enacting carbon taxes, and switching to renewable energy sources are examples of immediate climate change mitigation measures that frequently come with high prices. Certain groups may be disproportionately impacted by these expenses, especially the low-income neighborhood and the fossil fuel-dependent enterprises. For instance, employees and their family may experience a greater financial hardship as a result of the shift to a cleaner energy if the jobs in traditional energy industry are lost. Likewise, both public and private sector budget may be strained by the initial financial outlays needed by technical development and the infrastructure modification. So for the cost of inaction, ignoring the climate change can lead to severe economic consequences such as damage from extreme weather, increased medical expenses from illness linked to population, and lost productivity as a result of the climate change. According to the European Environment Agency (EEA), predicted losses from climate-related disaster can be used as a substitute for the cost of inaction, which, if the current trend continues, this could amount to hundreds of billions of dollars every year. On the other hand, the advantages of cutting carbon emissions are frequently longer term and more immaterial. These advantages include less extreme weather occurrence, more biodiversity, and greater public health due to the improved air quality. By lowering the future risks and boosting the community resilience, adaptation measures like ecological restoration and sustainable urban planning can also have a major positive economic effect. So study shows that the long-term benefit from prevented damage can greatly surpass the early cost of funding adaptation efforts, like reduce the extreme weather event and improve the public health, and also enhance the biodiversity and the community resilience. For instance, studies indicate that the long-term benefit of the green infrastructure can greatly outweigh the initial cost, like in Europe, every euro spent on the flood defenses can prevent up to the 400 euros in damage caused by the flood.
Hi, my name is Ahmad Afiq bin Azam, and I will present about the question number 4. And the question is, if you were in a position to recommend environmental policy change or action, what would you advocate and why? So my answer is, in this world that is increasingly moving toward modernity, many look down on the environmental change in our world. There are many environmental challenges, including climate change, loss of biodiversity, and various types of pollution, which are currently among the most important facing issues in the world. The challenge requires bold, innovative, and collaborative policy action that goes hand in hand with caring for the planet for future generations. By leading toward renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, ecosystem conservation, and waste reduction, one can offer a path toward sustainability, balancing environmental protection with economic growth and social equality. This can be done with policies and collective effort that will reduce environmental degradation, thus making room for a healthy and resilient planet. If I had to recommend change in environmental policy, I would use a multi-phase approach such as prioritizing renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and conservation. The transition to renewable energy such as solar, wind, and geothermal should be accelerated through subsidies and investment in infrastructure. These include regenerative agriculture practice that improve soil health, reduce emission, and increase biodiversity. Another important policy involves ecosystem protection and restoration. An example I can take is reforestation, planting plants that can produce fruit such as palm oil trees that can be used as daily cooking oil, planting mangrove to avoid tsunamis or high tide, and planting forest trees to be used as habitat, natural flora and fauna. Also, includes wetland preservation and marine conservation to combat climate change and protect biodiversity.
Let's discuss question 5. Do prosperous countries have a greater responsibility to take action and bear more of the cost of controlling climate change than developing countries? The answer is yes, and there are several key reasons for this. The first one is dual obligation. Wealthy nations have a dual responsibility. First, they need to significantly reduce their own emissions as they are among the highest contributor to greenhouse gases. Second, they must assist developing countries by funding efforts to adapt to climate impacts such as rebuilding after extreme weather events or transitioning to cleaner energy sources. Next, technological and financial capability. Prosperous countries have the advanced technology and resources required to drive the green economy. They can invest in renewable energy and disaster mitigation projects. They also have the financial means to fund large-scale climate initiatives, supporting both their own citizens and developing nations that lack such capabilities. The next one is historical contribution to emission. Developed nations, despite representing only 12% of the global population, are responsible for 50% of fossil fuel and industrial emission over the past 170 years. This activity has caused significant warming, approximately 1.1 Celsius, leading to more extreme climate events such as heat wave and wildfires. The next one is impact on vulnerable nations. Developing countries are disproportionately affected by climate change but lack of resources to address this impact. For example, Bangladesh is at risk of losing 10% of its land due to rising sea levels, which could displace 18 million people. Similar to Sub-Saharan Africa and Central America are already facing drought and poor harvest, forcing millions to migrate and causing political instability. Despite their commitment, wealthy nations have failed to meet pledges like the $100 billion annual climate finance goal, leaving vulnerable countries unable to adapt effectively. In conclusion, prosperous nations bear a greater responsibility because they have contributed the most to climate change historically, possess the resources to address it, and must lead the way in supporting global climate action.
Now, I would like to continue the presentation with question 6, which is, considering that negative impact of climate change will likely fall disproportionately on the poor, yet developing countries must often increase consumption and the emission to achieve greater economic growth. Do you think developing nations should be exempt from action to control climate change? Why or why not? To begin, climate change is undoubtedly a global issue, but its impact are felt mostly deeply in the developing countries. These nations often face a moral and economic dilemma: how to balance the need for economic development with the responsibility of addressing climate change. In my view, developing countries should not be entirely exempt from climate action. It's true that they contribute less historically to global emission, but every nation has a role to play in combating climate change. It can be seen in the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability as outlined by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) in the year of 1992. This principle recognizes that while all countries must act, their contribution should reflect their unique circumstances and capacities. The principle acknowledges that developing countries are more at risk due to the inadequate adaptive capacity, underscoring the need for global action. Furthermore, agreements like the Paris Agreement in 2015 highlight the importance of contribution from all nations, including developing countries. However, they also provide flexibility for these countries to ensure they can still prioritize economic and social progress. For instance, Malaysia's National Energy Transition Roadmap (NETR) shows how a developing country can embrace renewable energy and still promoting economic growth. Similarly, Bangladesh Music Climate Prosperity Plan is a great example of how a country can integrate climate goals into its development strategy when given the right support. Other than that, when we talk about ethical and economic challenges, one major concern is the intergenerational impact. The action we take today will directly affect the well-being of future generations. It's about making sure we leave a sustainable world for them. Another challenge is the energy transition. Shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy can be difficult for developing nations because it might slow down their economic growth. However, with the right support and training, planning from the developing nation and from the world, these challenges can be managed effectively. In conclusion, while I believe developing nations should take action, the responsibilities should be fair and based on what they can realistically do. With strong global cooperation, especially from developing nations, we can ensure that no country is left behind in the fight against climate change. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Alright, for next question about the climate change agreement approved in Paris is based on voluntary goals and pledged by participating countries. Will it ethically permissible to impose carbon emission goals on the countries that individuals and enforce them with penalties? Explain your reasoning. In my opinion, both parties have an ethical obligation to prevent harm to others, both the government and individuals. This is said to be because carbon emission contribute to climate-related disaster, crisis and economic instability. An example that can be highlighted is the Montreal Protocol 1987, which has been enforced as a global ban on ozone-depleting substance. Most of the countries agree to phase out hazardous chemicals that impose penalties for non-compliant countries. As a result, it successfully reduces ozone depletion and can deal with the global environmental crisis. Moreover, not all countries and individuals have the same capacity to reduce emissions. Developing countries and marginalized populations are among those who often lack the resource to transition to a low carbon economy. This is said because the cost of reducing carbon emission is very high. As an example, that can be highlighted using electric vehicle as a measure to reduce carbon emission. However, the cost of an electric vehicle is much more expensive than a normal vehicle. Therefore, the Green Climate Fund or GCF that has been established under the Paris Agreement has provided financial resources to developing countries to adapt and mitigate climate change. If penalties for emission are enforced, high-income countries can contribute more to such fund, ensuring fairness in addressing historical emission and unequal capacity. From another perspective, ethical policy must also be effective in achieving the intended goals. Penalties can create incentive and compliance, but they should be proportionate, fair, and avoid punitive measures that exacerbate inequality. Enforcement mechanism must avoid disproportionate impact and vulnerable groups or countries, as they would undermine ethical principles. As a notable example, China's recent enforcement of mandatory carbon reduction target incorporate penalty for non-compliance with subsidies for renewable energy. This dual approach has reduced emissions while supporting economic growth, demonstrating practical and effective enforcement. Last but not least, the conclusion is about imposing carbon emission target with penalties can be ethically justified when implemented through a fair and inclusive process that considers historical responsibilities and varying capacities among countries and individuals. To ensure fairness and equity, penalties should incentivize positive change without disproportionately burdening vulnerable groups or exacerbating existing inequalities. In addition, support mechanisms such as financial assistance and technological assistance are essential to help low-income countries and marginalized communities transition to sustainable practice. This balanced approach addresses the urgent need to combat climate change while upholding the ethical principle of justice, collective responsibilities, and the common good. And that's all from me. Thank you. Conclude, the Paris Agreement is an essential starting point in our global effort to combat climate change. For the first time in our history, nearly every nation has come together to address this critical issue and commit limiting global warming to no more than 2 Celsius of pre-industrial level. However, challenges remain. The lack of binding commitment make accountability difficult. There's also the moral responsibility to ensure that today's action protect future generations. Developing countries face unique struggle. They need economic growth to escape poverty while keeping emission low. Fairness and support from developed nations are essential. Moving forward, governments must work harder to strengthen the agreement terms, improve accountability, and ensure fairness. Innovation and cooperation will be key, and bold action is needed, not just to meet the current climate goals, but to secure a future where climate change is no longer a threat. By honoring the spirit of the Paris Agreement, we can create a sustainable future for generations to come. Let's continue to act with urgency, innovation, and global solidarity. Thank you.